time to make a crosscut sled. And I found this piece of 2x2 plywood that I'm going to use. And to start off, I'm going to measure corner to corner, make sure it's square, and it is. And that's going to come in here in a minute, because I'm going to trim off. Like I said, I found this piece in my scraps. I'm going to cut off a strip over here. It's not going to be a big sled, but the fact that we're starting off square, and it's square on all sides. I'm just going to trim off this right here. Trim off about that much. Just to make sure what we just cut off, there's our cut right there. And that's the same. I'm going to use that as a shortcut when I come back to do my back fence. Since we know we started off square, we know that cut square. Now I cut the strip off here just because that was a ragged strip over there. Had some pieces that I didn't want to keep on it. But now I'm going to turn it sideways, and I know the width of my miter slots is 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do, set my fence an inch and 3/4. And I'm going to cut a strip off this other side. What this is going to let me do is that will give me a little extra, so that I'll cut that much off, then I can cut that in half, and that'll be my 2 runners. With that being 1 3/4, move this over. Right about 3/4. I can run it through again. Now I'll check to see if it'll fit. It should be a little big for both of them. Rather have it too big than too small, so I'll just bump my saw over just a little bit. We'll run it through again. Still just a hair too big. Just keep shaving off a little at a time until you get a snug fit. You don't want it to get too loose. If it gets too loose, you have to start over. I'll just trim a little off the end. See if this does it. It looks like it does, so I'll go ahead and run them through. Check the fit of this one. It's snug, but it's not tight. No movement side to side. Looks about right, so we'll go ahead and cut the other one the same width. And that one works as well. Now, since I'm using 1/2 inch plywood, I measured this earlier, I believe it was 3/8 of an inch was the max depth for my miter slots. So I'll go ahead and basically cut this plywood on end, cut it halfway through, taking off just enough to get it back under 3/8 of an inch. I'll just flip it over, cut it through the other side. So now the total thickness of this piece of plywood will be just shy of 3/8 of an inch. You want it snug side to side, not tight, just snug. But if you push it all the way in, you want it to be below the top of the table saw. Now my two runners are done. I'm going to put the sled about where I want it to run and move my fence over so I'll be able to push the sled up against it when I'm attaching the rail. Keep in mind, all this time I'm making sure that when the side is up against the fence, it's also square with the table. Set that out of the way. Get out my trusty pennies. And I'm actually putting stacks of two, put 3 stacks on one miter track, 3 stacks on the other one. And this will make sure when I put my runners down, they'll be proud of the table. And when I put my sled down on top of them, they'll be resting on the runners themselves. To attach them, I'm just going to use CA glue. This is CA medium. I had thoughts of just putting a few spots of CA glue and then using wood glue in the middle. And that's about the time I realized I may as well just use CA glue for this. No need to waste time with the wood glue. Since I'm using CA glue only, I can go ahead and put it down in the miter slot. I'd started that other one on the outside of the miter slot in case I needed to get some of the wood glue off to prevent run out. But the CA glue, I don't need it. Now I'm just lining up the sled itself, spraying the accelerator on the bottom of that plywood. Now I'm going to line it up against the fence and against the table. The accelerator doesn't take long to work. Lift it up out of there. Get the pennies out. I really should move the fence before I try this. It's tight because I had it up against the fence. Notice when I move that fence out of the way, it just drops right in. And there we are. Fence, miter slots, and blade are all parallel and all perpendicular to the edge of that fence, that table. For the front and back of my sled, I'm going to be using 1x4s that have been planed so that they're parallel and jointed. Now, just as the size of your sled is dependent on what you want to use it for, how long you make your fences, and any shape you might want to add to it. Entirely up to you. I'm just going to cut it straight using the miter gauge that came with the saw. And I'm going to have the front and the back be identical. And you can see my runners are a couple inches longer than my sled. I'm actually going to leave it that way because I find it's easier just to slide it into the slot that way so I can see it. But if, feel free to cut that off if you'd like. This fence here doesn't have to be parallel. I'm going to make it parallel. It's this back one that has to be as close as you can get it lined up with that, the back of that sled. And this is where all that work at the beginning pays off, since we know the fence, the miter slots, and the blade are all parallel, and all of those are perpendicular to the edge of the table. When I put the sled down on the runners and made sure that was set properly, I can now take my fences, put them on the edge of the plywood, and get close enough to a 90-degree with the blade as I'm really ever going to need for this sled. I'll move the sled off the saw so I can spray that accelerator, line up that fence with the back of the sled, push it down. Like I said, as long as you make sure this fence lines up perfectly with the back of that sled, you've got 90 degrees to the blade. That back fence, same way, just spray the accelerator on the sled, put the fence down. I made mine parallel. You don't have to. Back one really doesn't matter. It's just there to keep the sled together once you cut through the bottom. Where I was willing to let the runners be held on with just CA glue, since there's really no pushing or pulling side to side on it. I am going to screw down these fences, pre-drill the holes. I'll go back through, countersink, and then finally follow up with 8 screws, making sure I don't get it close to where the blade's going to run. I'm just putting my screws out near the edges and then on the inside of the runners. That way I know it won't interfere with anything. Now when I drilled that hole, I got a little of the plywood sticking up. I'm just going to sand it all flush. Really doesn't need much. Now before I use it, I'm going to coat the entire bottom with paste wax. What I'm not going to worry about is coating the tops of these runners. As I'm doing the rest of the sled, I will push it up against the side a little bit just to get a light coat on the sides of the runners. But you've got to remember what we see here is the top of the runners or the bottom when the sled's in place won't actually be touching anything. So putting it there won't matter. Now I'll let that dry a little bit, come back through and wipe it off. Set it back in the miter slot. And there we go. Sled is done. Now for the first cut, raise the blade up, push it through, make sure it's sitting in the tracks. Now here I don't have my blade up much higher than the bottom of the sled, but I like doing this for the first cut through. I've set up a stop on my fence that ends before the blade. Just hold a piece of wood up against the back of the fence, push it through. Appears to be working as designed. I actually need these pieces cut, so this isn't just a test of the sled. So. But it does go to show I can have my stop on my fence and cut pieces longer than the sled is without a problem. Now I'll raise the blade up. Gonna cut through that back fence. Now I'm gonna raise it all the way up. I've still got plenty of room on that 1x4. This is about the maximum that I can use on this sled because I made the bottom out of 1/2 inch plywood. Saved me a lot of blade height. It also made it very light.